Let's understand the different modes of data binding. In Xamarin Forms, we have different modes of data binding like one-way, two-way, one-way to source, and one-time, etc. But right now, our concern is only with the one-way and two-way data binding modes. For other kind of modes, I will recommend you to visit the Xamarin Forms data binding official documentation. Alright, let's understand the one-way and two-way data binding inside the Xamarin Forms application. So I'm going to start with the one-way mode. Well, one-way is the most common mode of data binding. In one-way data binding, when we change the source, then target also changes. But when we change the target, then there is no change on the source itself. However, in the two-way data binding, when we change the source, then target changes, and when we change the target, then it will also change the source itself. Let's try to understand this concept with a simple example. So what I'm gonna do is, I'll simply add a stack layout in my XAML page, and then I'm going to add an entry control. I'm gonna set the placeholder of this entry to source. And similarly, I'm going to add another entry, and this time I'm going to set the placeholder to target. Alright, now I'm going to apply the data binding on the text property of the target entry. So inside this entry control, I'm going to set the text property equals, and then let's bind the text property of this entry with the source of this entry control. But before this, let's name this source entry to ent source, and here we go. Now inside the target entry, let's pick this ent source, and then we need to specify that which property of the source entry we are going to bind with the target entry. Of course, we are going to bind the text property of this source entry with this target entry. So let's use the path equals text. Now we need to specify the mode of the binding. Well, if we don't specify the mode, then mostly the default mode is one way. However, in case of few other controls, the default mode is two-way. Alright, I'm going to specify the mode here, and that is mode equals one way. And here we go. Now it's time to run this application. And on the mobile device, we have two different entries. One is for source and the other is for target. In one-way data binding, we have learned that source changes target, but target doesn't change the source. So let's try to figure out. Well, this is the source entry, and if we try to add anything in the source entry, then you will see a dramatic change in the target entry. But if we try to add anything in the target entry, then there is no effect on the source entry. Well, that's the one-way data binding. Now let's try to explore the two-way data binding mode. Well, in two-way data binding, source changes target and target changes source. So what I'm gonna do is, I'll simply add mode equals two-way, and after setting the mode equals two-way, you will see a different thing. So let me run this application so that I can explain to you the two-way binding. And here on the mobile device, we have two entries. The one is for source and the other is for target. Well, in two-way data binding, we have learned that source changes target and target changes source. So let's explore this further. Well, inside my source entry, if I add something, then you will see a change occurs in the target entry. And if I add anything in the target entry, then you will see that the source also changes. Right now we have covered the data binding and different modes of data binding. Now in the next module, we are going to explore the commands and navigations. Alright, I will catch you in the next module. In this section, we are going to explore the commands inside our Xamarin Forms application. Well, in normal Xamarin Forms application, when you want to interact with the button or a gesture, then you use the clicked event of a button or a tapped event handler of a tap gesture recognizer. However, when we work with MVVM, then the MVVM principle says that don't put anything in the code behind file. In MVVM, we will not create the button clicked events or things like that in the code behind file. In short, we will not use the event clicked. But now the question is, if we don't use the button clicked event, then how is it possible to interact with the button or other UI controls like gesture, menu item, search bar, list view, etc.? Well, in MVVM, we have a better approach to solve that kind of problem. And in order to solve this problem, we will use commands. So let's understand the commands. Well, in the main page.xaml, I'm gonna add a button control. And then inside this button control, let's set the text property of this button to login. Alright? Now inside this Xamarin Forms project, I need a class where I will put all the view models code. So what I'm gonna do is, I'll simply right click on the project and then let's create a new class and name it main view model. And here we go. Well, first of all, make this class to public. Then inside this class, I'm going to add a property of type iCommand. And let's name it login command. Well, if we go to the definition of this iCommand, then you will see that this iCommand is an interface. And it contains two methods. The one is can execute that returns some boolean value. And the other is this execute method which encapsulates some behavior. And in this execute method, we will put all the logic. Alright, let's jump back to the main view model. And don't worry about the initialization of this property. We will do the initialization within few seconds. Well, now we have this command in our view model, so we will use the data binding in our XAML file. Alright, first of all, let's jump back to the main page.xaml, and there, inside this button, I'm gonna add a command attribute. And then I'm gonna add a binding expression and then the name of our property that we have defined in the view model. So let's use this login command here. Now let's go back to our view model and initialize our command. So in the constructor, we set login command equals new command object. Let's bring the namespace that is xamarin.forms. Now this command has some overloads like this action that takes some object. Right now I am interested to use the action without any parameter. So I'm gonna add an action here and name it login. Right after that you will see an error, and that's because we have not created our function yet. So let's create a function by using the IntelliSense feature that comes along with the VL Studio. Or you can also create this function manually. Now inside this method, we will put all the logic. So if you have ever worked with the button clicked event, then you know that all the logic of the button will go inside the button clicked event. Similarly, when we work with MVVM, then all the logic of the button will go inside this command action method. Now, to bind this main page with the main view model, we need to set the binding context. So inside the code behind file of this main page, let's add a binding context equals new main view model. We can also set the binding context in the XAML file. But right now, let's stick with this approach because setting the binding context in the XAML file is easy, but when we pass parameters to the constructor of the main view model, then this approach will be helpful. Right now we are not passing any parameter to the constructor of this main view model, so we can also set the binding context in the main page.xaml file. So if you want to set the binding context in the XAML file, then you just need to call the binding context with this content page. And then inside this you can set your main view model like this. This approach is more reliable, but as I already told you, when we try to pass some parameters in the constructor of the main view model, then the code behind approach is more helpful. And that's why I'm going to use the code behind binding context approach. So let's get rid of this. Alright, now in the main view model, let's add a breakpoint with the login method. And then just try to execute this application. And here we go. You can see that we have a button control on the device. And if I tap this button, then you will see that the call goes to this login method. And it means that our binding is working perfectly. Now let's try to do something else. Well, in this login method, you cannot use the display alert directly. So if you want to use the display alert in the main view model, then simply use the app.current.main page, and then you can access all the properties and methods. And here is the display alert method. So I'm gonna call this method by simply providing some parameters here. It's time to run this application one more time. And this time if I tap this button, then you will see a nice looking pop-up appears. Alright, that's awesome. Now I'm gonna show you how you can pass the values inside this login method. So first of all, let's jump back to the main page.xaml, and then I'm gonna add an entry control and set the placeholder of this entry to username. Right after that, I'm going to bind the text property of this entry with some property that we will write in the main view model. So let's jump towards the main view model, and there I'm going to declare the property with get and set accessors. Well, if you don't know how to create a property, then use the following snippet, that is prop full, and then hit tab, and here we go. This will create the property automatically. Now I'm going to set the type of this backing field to string, and then name this backing field to username. Similarly, I'm going to change the name of this property to username. Alright, now we will not bind this backing field with our entry control because this backing field is private and it's only accessible within this main view model. However, this property is public and we need to bind this property with the text of the entry. So let's go back to the main page.xaml, and there inside this entry I'm going to bind the text property of this entry to username, and this username comes from the main view model. Now in the main view model you will see that we have already created this login method. Inside this login method we have a display alert, and this time instead of passing the static values, I'm gonna pass the username that we will write in the entry. And it means whatever you write in the entry will go to the username property, and there you will see that we have this field username equals value. In simple words, it means whatever you will write in the entry will go to the username property and will assign the value to this username field. Alright, now I'm going to access this private field inside the display alert. And here we go. Now it's time to run this application, and here you will see that we have an entry control. And I'm going to write some random name inside the entry control. And when I will press this button control, then you will see that in the pop-up we have the name that comes from this entry. Alright, let's do it one more time. So I'm going to pass the name here, and when I press the button, then you will see the name inside the display alert. Alright, now in the next module we will learn how to work with iNotify property change. So I will catch you in the next module.